It was supposed to be a perfect weekend. My daughter Emma had just turned 10, and she was thrilled when I suggested a camping trip to celebrate. We hadn't been able to get away much as a family lately, so this seemed like the perfect chance to make up for lost time. My wife Sarah was excited too. It would be a break from the grind, a chance to unplug and reconnect in nature. I rented a car that could handle the long drive and the rugged terrain of the mountains. It was a new model, loaded with features, everything you could want for a comfortable trip. Kind of car that practically drives itself, or so I thought. We packed up the gear, loaded Emma's favorite snacks, and set off early in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a warm glow over the road ahead. Everything felt right. But then, barely an hour into the drive, the first strange thing happened. The radio turned on by itself. I hadn't touched it. One moment we were cruising in silence. The next, an old country song crackled through the speakers. The kind of song that sounded like it was being played from an old, dusty record in some forgotten attic. I glanced at Sarah, who raised an eyebrow, but we both shrugged it off. Technical glitch? Maybe? Cars these days were packed with so much tech, it wasn't surprising if something got a little mixed up. We kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The GPS, which had been giving us clear directions, suddenly started glitching. The screen flickered, and the calm, reassuring voice of the navigator stuttered, then fell silent. When it came back on, the route had changed, leading us down a road I didn't recognize. "Dad, are we lost?" Emma asked from the back seat, her voice tinged with concern. I forced a smile. "Of course not, sweetheart. The GPS is just being weird. We're fine." But I wasn't so sure. I could feel it, the growing unease settling in my gut. The road we were on now was narrower, more isolated. Trees on either side were taller, thicker, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further we drove, the darker it seemed to get, even though it was still morning. It was as if the sunlight couldn't penetrate the canopy of trees above. And then the car started to resist me. The steering wheel felt heavy in my hands, like it had a mind of its own. I tried to turn back onto the main road. The wheel wouldn't budge. The engine made a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl, and the car veered left, taking us deeper into the woods. "Why are we going this way?" Sarah's voice was calm, but I could hear the edge of worry. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to stay calm for Emma's sake. "The car, it's not listening to me." She looked at me, eyes wide, but didn't say anything. I didn't have to tell her what she already knew. Something was very, very wrong. The tension in the car was palpable as we continued down the narrowing road, the trees closing in around us like a trap. I kept trying to take back control of the car, but it was no use. It was as if we were being guided by some unseen force, something that wanted us to go deeper into the woods. Emma started to whimper in the back seat. "Dad, I don't like this." "I know, sweetie," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "Just hold on, we'll be okay." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a winding path into nothingness. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more disoriented I felt. Every turn looked the same, and the trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. The sun had long disappeared behind thick, ominous clouds, casting the world into a gloomy twilight. As we drove, the car's behavior grew more erratic. The headlights flickered, sometimes plunging us into total darkness for agonizingly long seconds, before sputtering back to life. The dashboard lights flashed warnings: engine overheating, low tire pressure. But when I checked, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. Then there was the cold. It started as a subtle chill, but within minutes it became bone-numbing. We turned the heat up, but the vents blew nothing but freezing air. Sarah and Emma huddled together under a blanket in the back seat, their breath visible in the frigid air. "It's too cold, Dad," Emma whispered, teeth chattering. I could see the fear in her eyes, fear I was struggling to keep at bay myself. "I know, sweetie," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going to get through this." But the truth was, I had no idea how. The road continued to twist and turn, leading us deeper into the wilderness. I hadn't seen another car or a single sign of civilization for what felt like hours. The GPS had given up entirely, its screen now blank, a silent, useless piece of technology. And then the noises started. First, it was just a faint whispering, barely audible over the sound of the tires crunching on the gravel road. I thought it was my imagination, but as we drove on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the very air around us, a disembodied chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. Sarah noticed it too. She glanced at me, face pale. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Yeah, I hear it." The voices were coming from the trees, from the darkness just beyond the reach of our flickering headlight. They were too far away to make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing, as if they were warning us to turn back, leave this place. But there was no turning back. The car refused to respond to anything I did, continuing its relentless drive forward as if guided by an invisible hand. I could feel the tension rising in my chest, growing sense of dread that something terrible was about to happen. Then, out of nowhere, a figure darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, car screeching to a halt. For a moment, the world was still. The only sound, the rapid thumping of my heart in my chest. I stared out into the darkness, my hands trembling on the wheel. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know," I replied, my eyes scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the thick fog that seemed to close in around us. Emma whimpered from the back seat, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "Daddy, I want to go home." "I know, sweetheart," I said, wishing more than anything that I could take her home, away from whatever horrors awaited us in these woods. But I was powerless, trapped in a car that no longer obeyed me, on a road that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into the unknown. With a shaky breath, I eased my foot off the brake, and the car started moving again, slowly, as if reluctant to continue. Figure, whatever it had been, was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. But the unease lingered, a heavy weight on my chest. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. They seemed to be inside the car now, surrounding us, filling every corner with their unintelligible murmurs. The cold deepened, seeping into my bones, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing, the whispers now louder than ever, filling the void left by the car's sudden silence. "We're stuck," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We're stuck in the middle of nowhere." And in that moment, I knew we weren't alone. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any light, but as I swiped at the screen, it stayed black. No signal, no flashlight, nothing. The whispers outside the car had turned into low, guttural murmurs, like a group of people just beyond the windows, speaking in hushed, sinister tones. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to find help." "How?" I replied, my own voice barely steady. "We're in the middle of nowhere, and the car's dead." But she was right. We couldn't just sit here, surrounded by whatever was out there in the woods. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy with dread. But I knew that if we stayed, something bad, something worse than what we were already experiencing, was going to happen. I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. There's a campsite nearby. It's not where we were supposed to go, but it's our best bet. We'll have to walk. Emma clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, her wide eyes filled with fear. "But it's dark, Daddy, and cold." "I know, sweetheart," I said, trying to soothe her even as fear gnawed at me. "But we'll be together. I'll keep you safe, I promise." With shaking hands, I opened the car door, and the cold hit me like a physical force, sharp and biting. The whispers stopped abruptly, as if the act of stepping out into the night had caught them off guard. I helped Sarah and Emma out of the car, keeping them close as I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk. Miraculously, it still worked, though the beam was weak, barely cutting through the fog that now seemed to cling to us. "Stay close to me," I whispered, more to reassure myself than them. The road was no longer visible. The fog had swallowed it whole, leaving only a narrow path that led into the trees. The forest seemed alive, shifting and whispering with every step we took. I kept the flashlight low, scanning the ground in front of us, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight, a shadow darting between the trees, figure standing still before disappearing as the light passed over it. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every sound, crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches, echoed in the oppressive silence. I could feel Sarah's hand gripping my arm tightly, and Emma's small fingers clutched my jacket as if letting go would mean losing us to the darkness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we walked, the path winding deeper into the woods. The whispers had returned, now accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant, eerie hoot of an owl. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but every rustle, every creak of the trees set my nerves on edge. Then up ahead, a flicker of light, dim and orange, like the glow of a distant campfire. "There," I whispered, more to myself than to the others. Relief washed over me, though it was tinged with unease. That must be the campsite. We quickened our pace, eager to reach the light to find some semblance of safety. But as we approached, the unease grew stronger, gnawing at my gut. The light wasn't warm and inviting. It was weak, flickering as if struggling to stay alive. The campsite itself was empty, abandoned. 3 tents were set up around the dying fire, but there was no sign of life, no movement, no sound except for the crackle of the embers and the whispers that seemed to circle us. "I don't like this," Sarah murmured, voicing the fear that was clawing at my insides. "Where is everyone?" "I don't know," I admitted, scanning the campsite. The tents looked old, as if they'd been there for years, forgotten and untouched. But that didn't make sense. They couldn't have been here that long, not with a fire still burning, however faintly. Emma tugged at my sleeve. "Daddy, I think they're hiding." "Who, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. "The people in the tents," she whispered, her voice quivering. "They're scared of the bad things in the forest, like we are." A chill ran down my spine. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling as I realized how quiet it had become. The whispers had stopped again, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. "We need to find help." Sarah insisted, but her voice was hollow, as if she knew there would be no help, no escape. I nodded, though my instincts were screaming at me to run, to get away from this place. But where could we go? The road was gone, car was dead, and we were lost in a forest that seemed to want us here. Trap us. I could feel it, the weight of the woods pressing in on us, the presence of something unseen, lurking just beyond the firelight. And then, from the shadows, came a sound that froze me to the core, a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the trees, getting closer. We weren't alone. We had never been alone. The growl echoed through the trees, low and menacing, primal sound that sent shivers down my spine. I instinctively pulled Sarah and Emma closer, flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to locate the source of the noise. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, twisted shadows that danced across the tents, making it impossible to tell where the threat was coming from. "Stay behind me," I whispered, though I wasn't sure how much good it would do. Whatever was out there was nothing I could protect them from. Not with just a flashlight and sheer willpower. Growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, a dark, malevolent force circling us, toying with us. Then suddenly, the tent closest to the fire collapsed in on itself, as if something huge had brushed past it. Emma screamed, and I nearly dropped the flashlight as I spun toward the sound, the weak beam cutting through the darkness just in time to catch a glimpse of something. Something massive and shadowy, slipping back into the trees. "We need to go," Sarah whispered urgently, pulling Emma close. Her voice was steady, but I could see the terror in her eyes. "Now," I nodded, trying to gather the courage to move, to leave the false safety of the campsite and venture back into the woods. But before I could take a step, a new sound joined the growling. Chorus of whispers, louder now, and distinct, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once, rising from the ground, from the trees, from everywhere. "They're coming," Emma whimpered, burying her face in Sarah's side. "They're coming to get us." The temperature dropped sharply. our breath fogging in the air as the whispers grew more insistent, more angry. I could feel it. Presence, many presences, closing in on us. Flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw them. Figures, barely more than shadows, standing at the edge of the firelight, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me. These weren't animals. They weren't even human. They were something else. Something ancient and angry. Something that wanted us here, that had lured us into this cursed forest, and was now coming to claim us. I took a step back, pulling Sarah and Emma with me, but the figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching, waiting, as if they knew we had nowhere to go. The growling started again, this time from multiple directions, the sound reverberating through the trees, and the whispers turned into harsh guttural chants that filled the air, vibrating with malice. And then, as if responding to some unseen command, the figures began to move forward, slowly, deliberately, closing the distance between us and them. "Run!" I shouted, the word tearing itself from my throat as I turned and bolted into the woods, dragging Sarah and Emma with me. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, casting erratic beams of light that only served to disorient me more. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches reaching out like claws shifting under our feet, trying to trip us up, to drag us down. The growls and chants followed us, echoing through the trees, cacophony of terror that drove us deeper into the dark, unfamiliar woods. I didn't know where we were going, only that we had to keep moving, keep running, until we found a way out, or until whatever was chasing us caught up. Emma was sobbing, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clung to Sarah. I could hear Sarah's labored breathing too, and I knew we couldn't keep this up for long. We were exhausted, terrified, lost in a forest that seemed to twist and change with every step, leading us in circles, deeper into its clutches. Then up ahead, through the dense fog and twisted branches, I saw a light, dim, flickering, but unmistakable. It wasn't the cold, eerie glow of the campsite. This was different. Warm, like the light of a lantern. "There," I gasped, pointing ahead. "A way out." But even as I said it, I felt a pang of doubt. Nothing in this forest was what it seemed. But what choice did we have? We had to reach that light, whatever it was, wherever it led. We stumbled toward the light, the sounds of pursuit growing louder, closer. The figures were right behind us now. I could feel their cold breath on the back of my neck, hear their guttural growls in my ear. But I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I just had to keep running, keep moving forward, toward the light, toward hope. Even as a voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was a trap, that we were running straight into the jaws of whatever nightmare had claimed this forest as its own. Finally, we burst into a small clearing, and there it was, a solitary cabin, its windows glowing with the warm flickering light of a fire inside. For a brief fleeting moment, relief washed over me. Shelter. Safety. But then I saw it, carved into the door, barely visible in the dim light. A symbol, ancient and twisted, the same symbol that had been etched into the trees along the path, the same symbol that marked this forest as cursed, as a place of death. Before I could react, the door creaked open, and the light inside flickered ominously, as if beckoning us in. Behind us, the growls grew louder, figures closing in. We had no choice. We stepped into the cabin, the door slamming shut behind us, sealing us inside with whatever awaited within. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening thud, sealing us inside the cabin. The sudden silence was jarring, as if the walls had swallowed the growls and whispers that had hounded us through the forest. For a moment, all I could hear was our ragged breathing, harsh and desperate in the oppressive stillness. The cabin was small, cramped, its walls lined with dark, weathered wood. A single, dimly burning lantern hung from a hook in the ceiling, casting flickering shadows that danced across the room. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something else, something foul and ancient, the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Fire in the hearth crackled weakly, casting a sickly orange glow over the room. I scanned the space, looking for any sign of who or what might live here, but there was nothing. No furniture, no signs of life, just that terrible symbol carved into the door, now glowing faintly as if it had a life of its own. "We shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered, voice trembling. "We have to leave." "I know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. But the door was shut tight, and I knew, just knew, that whatever was out there was waiting for us. We were trapped, caught between the horrors outside and the unknown terror within these walls. Emma clung to me, her small body trembling. "Daddy, I'm scared." "I know, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to get us out of here. I promise." But even as I said the words, I could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in on us, as if the very walls were alive, breathing, watching us. The fire flickered again, casting grotesque, twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I could hear a faint, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat, pulsing through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. And then the chanting began. It was low at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more intense, filling the cabin with a cacophony of voices. It was the same guttural language we'd heard in the forest, spoken by the same unseen entities that had chased us here. The words were foreign, incomprehensible, but their intent was clear. They were calling to something, summoning something. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy, and the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the walls, crystallizing in intricate, unnatural patterns. The fire in the hearth sputtered, flames dancing erratically as if struggling against some unseen force. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. A figure, tall and gaunt, body twisted and unnatural, stepped into the weak light of the lantern. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, black and empty, bore into us with a malevolence that made my blood run cold. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive with the voices of the damned. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, its fingers elongated and claw-like, and the cabin seemed to shudder in response. The walls closed in around us, the space growing smaller, tighter, as if the cabin itself was trying to trap us, consume us. "Stay back!" I shouted, stepping in front of Sarah and Emma, but the figure didn't stop. It moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, empty eyes fixed on us, as if it was savoring the fear radiating from us. The symbol on the door glowed brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly energy that filled the room with a sickly light. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the voices screaming in unison as the figure reached out for its hand inches from my face. I grabbed the lantern, the only weapon I could think of, and swung it at the figure with all my strength. The glass shattered, spilling oil and flames across the room. For a moment, the figure recoiled, flames licking at its skin, but it didn't burn. Instead, it laughed, a low, guttural sound that made my stomach turn. The fire spread quickly, climbing the walls, but instead of consuming the wood, it seemed to feed on it, growing brighter, hotter, until the entire cabin was engulfed in flames. The figure stepped back into the shadows, the chanting fading into a low hum, as if it had done what it came to do. And then I realized, this was no ordinary fire. The flames weren't consuming the cabin. They were transforming it, warping the walls, the floor, the very air around us. The symbol on the door blazed with an intense light, and the cabin began to shift, twist, as if it was being torn from reality itself. "We have to get out," Sarah screamed, pulling Emma toward the door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The wood was hot to the touch, pulsing with the same energy that filled the room. Cabin shuddered violently, and suddenly the floor gave way beneath us. We fell, plummeting into darkness, fire, the chanting, figure, all disappearing as we were swallowed by the void. I don't know how long we fell. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? Time lost all meaning as we tumbled through the darkness, the air rushing past us, cold seeping into our bones, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, stop. We hit the ground hard, impact knocking the breath out of me. I lay there for a moment, dazed, the darkness pressing in on me. Then I heard it, Emma's voice, weak and trembling. "Daddy, where are we?" I forced myself to sit up, my head spinning. We were no longer in the cabin. We were in the forest again, but it was different. Trees were twisted, their branches like claws reaching out to the sky. The ground was cold, hard like stone, and the air was thick with fog. We're not in the same place," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with terror. "We're somewhere else." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The cabin hadn't just trapped us. It had taken us somewhere else, somewhere beyond the forest, beyond reality. The chanting was gone. Growls were silent. The oppressive presence remained, lurking just beyond the fog, watching, waiting. I pulled Sarah and Emma close, the cold seeping into my bones as I scanned the twisted landscape. There was no path, no way out, just an endless expanse of fog and darkness. "We have to keep moving," I said, though I had no idea where we could go. "We can't stay here." We stood up, our legs shaking, and began to walk, fog closing in around us. The forest was silent, eerily so, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then from the darkness, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Welcome," it said, the words slithering through the air like a serpent. "You're home." My heart sank as the fog thickened, the darkness deepening around us. We were trapped, caught in a place beyond time, beyond reason, where the nightmares of the forest had come to life. And there was no escape. We kept walking, the whispers growing louder, closer, until they surrounded us, a constant, suffocating presence. The ground beneath our feet shifted, and I knew we were being watched, herded like prey. And then, up ahead, I saw it, a faint light, flickering in the distance, just like the one that had led us to the cabin. But this time, I knew better. I stopped, pulling Sarah and Emma close, my heart pounding in my chest. "We can't go that way," I whispered, my voice shaking. "It's a trap." But as we stood there frozen in fear, the light grew brighter, fog thinning around it. And then, as if in response, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. I turned, my heart racing, and saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. They moved slowly, deliberately, closing in on us from all sides. There was no escape. I took a deep breath, pulling Sarah and Emma closer, and whispered, "No matter what happens, I love you." And then, as the figures closed in, the light in the distance flared brightly, blinding us, and everything went black. I remember the excitement in my daughter's eyes as we packed the last of our gear into the car. It was her idea to go camping. Who was I to say no? The thought of spending a weekend in the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of the city, sounded perfect. My wife, always the planner, had picked out the spot, a remote forest known for its pristine beauty. We were looking forward to the trip, a chance to reconnect as a family. But as I stood there, double-checking the straps on the roof rack, a strange feeling washed over me. It was that nagging sense you get when you feel like you're forgetting something important, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I shook it off, blaming it on pre-trip jitters. I didn't know then that this was the first sign, a warning I was too blind to see. The car, a rental, was larger than what we usually drove. I figured it would be better for the long drive. From the moment I sat in the driver's seat, something felt off. The leather was cold, colder than it should have been on a warm summer morning. The steering wheel had a slight tremble to it, like it was alive with some barely contained energy. My wife noticed it too, but we both just shrugged it off. After all, it was just a car. First few hours of the drive were uneventful. My daughter fell asleep in the back seat, and my wife hummed softly to the music on the radio. The road ahead was clear, stretching out into the distance like a promise. But then, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, things started to change. It began with the GPS. One moment it was guiding us along a perfectly straight highway, and the next, it was recalculating. "Rerouting," said in that calm, robotic voice. I glanced at the screen, confused. We hadn't made any turns. The road was still straight. The GPS insisted we'd gone off course. My wife tapped the screen, trying to figure it out. Nothing worked. The map was blank, save for the pulsating dot that marked our location, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Then the radio cut out. 1 second, there was music, and the next, there was only static. I twisted the dial, searching for a station, but all I got was white noise. My wife fiddled with her phone, trying to find a signal to stream something, but her screen showed no service. That's when I noticed the headlights. They flickered, just for a moment, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I glanced at my wife, but she was busy trying to get the GPS to work. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to worry her, but the feeling in my gut, that sense of wrongness, kept growing. The sun was setting now, the sky bleeding orange and red, and the road ahead was darkening faster than it should have. The trees on either side of the highway seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to keep my focus. But the car had other ideas. It began to pull to the left, just slightly at first. I corrected it, thinking maybe the alignment was off. But then it pulled harder, like it was fighting me. The steering wheel twitched in my hands, jerking toward the trees that lined the road. "Did you feel that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My wife looked up from the GPS, her face pale. "What do you mean?" "The car," I said, gritting my teeth as I struggled to keep it on the road. It's pulling." She stared at me, then at the road, and back at the steering wheel. "Maybe it's the wind," she suggested, though her voice wavered with doubt. But there was no wind. The air outside was still, oppressive even. And the car, it wasn't just pulling anymore. It was pushing. It was like it had a mind of its own, like it was trying to drag us off the road, into the trees, into the dark. I pressed down on the brake. The car didn't slow. Anything, it sped up, the engine roaring as the speedometer climbed higher. My wife grabbed the dashboard, her knuckles white, and my daughter stirred in the back seat, her sleep disturbed by the sudden acceleration. "Daddy?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "It's okay, sweetheart," I lied, my heart pounding. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. It was far from fine. The car was out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. And in that moment, as the last light of day vanished behind the horizon and the road ahead plunged into darkness, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. We were no longer in control of our own fate. The road ahead was a tunnel of darkness, the only light coming from our flickering headlights. I pressed the brake pedal to the floor. The car refused to slow down. The speedometer needle hovered near 60, even though I wasn't pressing the gas. My wife was gripping the seat so tightly that her fingers were leaving indentations in the fabric. I could feel her fear rising, matching my own. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "I don't know," I muttered, my eyes darting between the road and the dashboard. The warning lights were going crazy. Check engine, low fuel, overheating. Every indicator flashing as if the car was having a breakdown of its own. The trees on either side of us seemed to close in, the branches stretching out like skeletal arms, scraping against the car as we sped by. It was like the forest was alive, trying to pull us into its embrace. The road was no longer straight. It twisted and turned, winding deeper into the woods, though I didn't remember any turns on the map. But the GPS was useless now, just a blank screen with that mocking rerouting message. And then, just as suddenly as it started, car began to slow down. I didn't ease off the brake. No, it was as if the car decided to let us go, reducing speed until we were barely moving. My wife let out a shaky breath, her grip on the seat loosening. "Thank God," she whispered, but I wasn't ready to thank anyone just yet. The road ahead was still dark, the trees still looming. My daughter, now fully awake, leaned forward between the seats, her small voice trembling. "Daddy, are we lost?" I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "No, sweetheart, we're just taking a different route." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. We were lost. And it wasn't just the road we'd lost. Something was happening, something beyond my understanding. Car wasn't just malfunctioning, it was alive. It had a purpose. The speedometer dropped to 0 as we coasted to a stop. The engine idled, the headlights dimmed, and the world outside was eerily silent. I reached for the ignition, ready to turn the car off, but as soon as my fingers brushed the key, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't music. It wasn't even static. It was a voice, a low, guttural whisper, speaking in a language I didn't understand. My wife gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and my daughter shrank back into her seat, covering her ears. "Turn it off," my wife hissed, her eyes wide with fear. I fumbled with the dial, trying to kill the sound. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It was like it was coming from inside the car, surrounding us, seeping into our bones. The words were sharp, jagged, like nails scraping against glass, and with each syllable, the temperature in the car dropped. I could see my breath now, fogging up the windshield. "Turn it off," my wife screamed, panic rising, but I couldn't. The car was no longer listening to me. The headlights flared, blinding us for a moment before cutting out entirely, plunging us into total darkness. The voice on the radio reached a fever pitch, chorus of incomprehensible words that made my head pound, my vision blur, And then, without warning, the engine died. The radio cut out, leaving us in silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I turned to my wife, face pale and drawn. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice low and trembling. Before she could respond, something slammed into the car, hard enough to rock it on its wheels. My daughter screamed, and my wife grabbed her, pulling her close. I looked out the window, but there was nothing. Just the endless dark, pressing in on us from all sides. Another impact, this time from the back. The car lurched forward, the sound of metal crunching, and I could feel the cold seep in, like a chill creeping up from the ground. I turned the key, desperate to start the car, to get us moving, but the engine just clicked, refusing to turn over. We were trapped. And whatever was out there, it was coming for us. "Daddy," my daughter whispered, her voice small and scared. "I'm scared." I reached back, squeezing her hand. "It's okay, sweetheart," I lied again. "Everything's going to be okay." But we all knew the truth. We were alone, in the middle of nowhere, with something unseen and malevolent surrounding us. The car was dead, the forest was alive, and there was no one coming to save us. And in that moment, I realized there was no escape. Whatever had taken control of our car, whatever had led us here, wasn't going to let us go. We were at its mercy. And mercy was the last thing it had in mind. The silence after the impacts was deafening. But it didn't last long. The sounds began, soft at first like the rustling of leaves in a light breeze. But it wasn't the wind. It was something moving, circling the car. I could hear it outside, scraping along the metal, tapping on the windows, as if testing our defenses. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. "Stay down," I whispered to my wife and daughter, my voice cracked, betraying the fear I was trying to hide. I couldn't see anything through the windows. The darkness outside was impenetrable, thicker than any night I'd ever known. But I could feel it out there. Something malevolent, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Another tap on the window, this time on my wife's side. She flinched, pulling our daughter closer, shielding her with her body. I could barely breathe, the air in the car growing colder by the second. My breath came out in shaky clouds, my hands trembling as I reached for the door lock, double-checking it even though I knew it was already secured. And then I saw it. A face, or what passed for one, pressed against the glass. It was pale, almost luminescent, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight into my soul. The skin was stretched tight over the bone, too tight, like it had been drained of life. Its mouth was twisted into a grin, teeth yellow and sharp. And as it breathed, the window fogged up, leaving streaks of frost. I froze, unable to look away. It wasn't human, couldn't be. The eyes were too large, too dark, and the grin was too wide, too unnatural. It just stared at me, unblinking, that twisted smile growing wider, as if it knew exactly what it was doing to me. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything, but all I could do was sit there, paralyzed by fear. My wife, seeing the look on my face, slowly turned her head to the window. The moment she saw it, she let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. Our daughter, sensing the tension, started to cry softly, the sound almost drowned out by the pounding of my heart. The creature outside the window didn't move. It just stared, its grin never faltering, its eyes never leaving mine. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew one thing. It was playing with us, enjoying our fear. This wasn't a random encounter. It had been waiting for us, drawing us in with the car, with the road, with every little thing that had gone wrong since we left home. The face slowly retreated from the glass, disappearing into the darkness. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. I knew there were more of them out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. I could feel them, hear them, their low whispers growing louder, filling the air with a language I couldn't understand. A language that made my skin crawl. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We have to get out of here." But how? The car wouldn't start, and even if it did, where would we go? We were lost in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by God knows what, and there was no clear path to safety. But staying here, that wasn't an option. Not with those things out there, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. I grabbed the key, twisting it in the ignition, praying for a miracle. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The headlights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead, or what was left of it. The asphalt was cracked, crumbling at the edges, as if something had torn it apart. The trees on either side had twisted, their branches now gnarled and claw-like, reaching out toward the car. The path that had been there before was gone, replaced by a narrow, winding trail that led deeper into the forest, into the heart of the darkness. "Drive," my wife urged, her voice tight with fear. "Just drive." I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the car into gear and hit the gas, the tires screeching as we lurched forward. The car groaned, as if it was in pain, but it moved, following the twisted trail, deeper into the woods. The whispers grew louder as we drove, the language incomprehensible but full of malice. Shadows darted between the trees, keeping pace with us, just out of sight. I could see them in the corner of my eye, flickering like ghosts, always there, but never fully visible. "Don't stop," my wife kept saying, her voice trembling. "Don't stop." But I knew that stopping wasn't the problem. The problem was where we were headed. The path we were on. It wasn't leading us out. It was leading us in, deeper into whatever hell this forest had become. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in until the sky above was nothing but a sliver of black. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the whispers. They were inside the car now, right in my ear, telling me things, horrible things. And then up ahead I saw it, a light, faint and flickering, but unmistakable. It was coming from a clearing just beyond the next bend. My heart leapt, hope flaring in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, we could find help, find a way out. But as we rounded the bend, my hope died. The light wasn't from a house or a car or anything that could save us. It was from a fire, a small, crackling fire in the center of the clearing, surrounded by stones. And around the fire were figures, dozens of them, their faces hidden by the shadows, their bodies cloaked in tattered rags. They didn't move, didn't react to the car's approach. They just stood there, staring at the flames, their heads bowed as if in prayer. But I knew better. There was no prayer here, only death. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt at the edge of the clearing. The figures slowly turned toward us, their faces still hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on us, burning with hunger. This was it. The end of the road. We were trapped, surrounded, and whatever these things were, they weren't going to let us leave. And as they started to move, slowly advancing on the car, I realized with a cold, sinking dread that we had driven straight into their trap. There was no escape. They moved slowly at first, as if savoring the moment. The figures circled the car, their faces still hidden beneath those ragged hoods, their eyes, if they had any, burning through the darkness. The fire in the clearing flickered, casting grotesque shadows on their tattered clothes, making them seem even less human, more like twisted specters risen from the earth itself. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I felt like a caged animal, trapped with no way out, and the air in the car was suffocating. My wife gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin, her breathing ragged. My daughter whimpered, burying her face in her mother's lap, trying to hide from the nightmare unfolding around us. I had to do something. We couldn't just sit here, waiting for them to close in. My mind raced, desperate for a plan, any plan. The engine was still running, but the path behind us had vanished into the dark, swallowed by the forest that seemed to shift and breathe like a living thing. The only way out was forward, through the clearing, through them. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "Hold on," I whispered, more to myself than to my wife or daughter. "We're getting out of here." I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The figures around us didn't flinch, didn't even seem to notice as we barreled toward the fire. For a split second I thought maybe, just maybe, we could plow through them, reach the other side and escape whatever hell this was. Then the car stopped. It didn't slow down, didn't skid to a halt. Just stopped, as if an invisible wall had slammed down in front of us. The sudden jolt threw us forward, my wife and daughter crying out as the seatbelts cut into our chests. The engine roared in protest, the tires spinning uselessly against the ground. But we didn't move an inch. It was as if something had rooted us in place, holding us there like prey in a spider's web. The figures, now fully aware of us, started to close in. They didn't walk. They glided, their feet barely touching the ground, their movements smooth and unnatural, like they were floating just above the earth. The firelight danced across their faces as they drew closer, revealing the horrors beneath those hoods. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones that jutted out at odd angles. Their eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb the light, and their mouths were twisted into grotesque grins, filled with sharp, jagged teeth, gleamed like polished stones. They were wrong, all wrong, as if something had taken the idea of a human being and warped it into a mockery of life. My wife was sobbing now, clutching our daughter to her chest, whispering frantic prayers that I hadn't heard in years. I could feel the tears welling up in my own eyes, the hopelessness settling in like a lead weight in my stomach. This was it. This was how it ended. The first of the figures reached the car, its long, bony fingers scraping against the glass with a sound that made my skin crawl. The others followed, surrounding us on all sides, their faces pressed against the windows, their breath fogging up the glass. They tapped on the windows, on the roof, on the doors, a rhythmic drumming that sent chills down my spine. It was as if they were testing the strength of the car, trying to find a way in. And then the chanting began. Low, guttural, and ancient, filled the air, vibrating through the metal of the car, through my bones, through my soul. It was the same language I'd heard on the radio, but now it was louder, more powerful, a dark symphony that threatened to drown out everything else. The figures outside moved in unison with the chant, their bodies swaying, their fingers tapping in time with the rhythm. My head pounded, the sound drilling into my mind, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I could feel something pushing against my consciousness, something ancient and malevolent trying to force its way in. I fought against it, clinging to the last shreds of my sanity. But it was overwhelming, relentless. Car's interior grew colder, frost creeping across the windows, breath of the figures outside visible in the frigid air. I could see my wife's lips turning blue, my daughter's eyes wide with terror as she clung to her mother. We were all trembling, cold seeping into our bones, slowing our movements, numbing our senses. And then, as if in response to the chant, the car began to change. The dashboard lights flickered, then dimmed, and the radio crackled back to life, broadcasting that same horrifying chant in a loop. The steering wheel vibrated under my hands, the metal freezing cold to the touch, and the seats beneath us started to harden, fabric stiffening like ice. It was as if the car itself was becoming part of the nightmare, morphing into something else, something that wasn't going to let us go. I could feel the fear rising, threatening to consume me. My mind raced, looking for a way out, but every option led to the same conclusion. There was no escape. Whatever these things were, they had us right where they wanted us, and they weren't going to let us leave. The chanting grew louder, the figures pressing closer, their grins widening, their teeth bared in hungry anticipation. I could feel the pressure building, the cold tightening around my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. And then, just as I thought the darkness would swallow us whole, my daughter did something I didn't expect. She screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, it was a scream of defiance, raw and primal, cutting through the chant like a knife. Her small voice shattered the air, the sound echoing through the clearing, through the car, through my mind. It was a scream of survival, of pure, desperate willpower. And in that moment, everything changed. Figures outside froze, their chanting faltering, the rhythm breaking. Pressure on the car lessened, cold receding, and for the first time since we'd entered the clearing, I felt a sliver of hope. My daughter's scream had broken their hold on us. Only for a moment. And that moment was all I needed. I twisted the key in the ignition, praying to every god I'd ever heard of, and the engine roared to life. The headlights flared brighter than before, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The figures recoiled, hissing like animals, their twisted faces contorting in pain as the light hit them. "Hold on," I shouted, lowering the gas pedal. The car surged forward, breaking free of the invisible barrier that had held us in place. The tires tore through the earth, scattering dirt and rocks as we sped through the clearing, past the fire, past the figures that shrieked in rage as we escaped their grasp. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My entire focus was on the road ahead, path opening up before us, the trees parting as if they were making way for our escape. The car roared through the darkness, engine howling, the headlights burning bright, and all I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The chanting faded into the distance, the shadows thinning, the night growing less oppressive with every mile. The road straightened, trees thinning out, and then, finally, mercifully, we burst out of the forest and into the open air. The night sky was clear, the stars shining brightly above us, and the road ahead was straight and true. I kept driving, not daring to slow down, not until I was sure we were safe. Not until the forest was just a memory in the rearview mirror. Only then did I ease off the gas, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My wife was crying, holding our daughter close, and my daughter, my brave little girl, was silent, her eyes wide but dry, her scream still echoing in my mind. We had escaped, but the terror of that night would never leave us. It was branded into our souls, a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. And as I drove into the dawn, the sun rising on the horizon, I knew one thing for certain: we would never be the same again. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. Decant.